And so moving right along here. By the way, before we start, I did get a new microphone here. So I know a lot of you have been complaining about the sound quality. So hopefully this will be a much better experience. Also got a new webcam. So hopefully that will rectify some of the low production values. So we're on page 263 of Steiner's Outline of Esoteric Science. And one thing I forgot to mention yesterday is beginning with Atlantis and then these 5 Post-Atlantean civilizations, each one of these civilizations has a specific task in which they ultimately have to perfect one aspect of his subtle bodies. So in other words, the task of Atlantis was to perfect the physical body, which, as we saw, slowly densified over time and became physical. And then, so after Atlantis, we move into the 5 Post-Atlantean epochs. We're in the 5th now, and each one perfects one of them. The Hindu civilization perfects, of course, the etheric body, and then the Persian civilization perfects the astral body. The Egypto-Chaldean civilization then perfects the sentient soul, and then the Greco-Latin civilization perfects the mind soul, or the intellectual soul, and then, which corresponds perfectly, as we saw, with Jean Gebser's mental consciousness structure, and then that goes all the way down from 747 to 1413 AD, whereupon the West task is to perfect the consciousness soul, which involves the perfection of free will. But it has a schism within it that has to be healed between Lucifer and Ahriman, as we'll see. And that date roughly corresponds actually also with Gebser, with the second half of his mental consciousness structure, which he calls the perspectival consciousness structure. Depth perspective in painting, a couple decades after 1413, is just coming in and is just being perfected. And so that corresponds to Gebser as well. And so the future civilizations then will perfect the 6th will perfect the life spirit, and the 7th will perfect the spirit self. So now, with respect to Egypto-Chaldean civilization, the dates that he gives are 2907 to 747 BC, which are more or less accurate. He gives a very sketchy couple of pages here about Egypt, doesn't go into much detail about it. And I don't think that Steiner ever researched these civilizations in any kind of detail, because clearly he has a very sketchy knowledge of them, but he's only interested in looking at them from the astral point of view, from the point of view of etheric and astral energies. So in that sense, that's really all he's looking for. And as he said, Ahriman is a big problem here, because the task of these post-Atlantean civilizations is to bring knowledge of the spiritual world down onto the sense-perceptible plane, and to perceive through the sense-perceptible plane the spiritual radiance coming through it. And the Hindus, of course, did an excellent job of this. Ahriman, the god of matter, never tempted them, and they had no interest in him. Whereas with regard to the Persian civilization and Zarathustra, the sense-perceptible world, as we saw, was not an illusion, but a real thing, and a real danger where people could fall under the influence of Ahriman. But his religion was based on the recognition of the god of light, Ahura Mazda, and seeing that as a salvation toward blocking Ahriman's attempt to block knowledge of the spiritual world. And it's interesting because Steiner has this idea that, things that happen on the physical plane affect not only your existence on the other side, but also your reincarnation. So if you fall under the influence of Ahriman and you think matter is the only thing that's real, you're going to reincarnate as a materialist again, or an egoist. What happens to you affects your subsequent incarnations. And to that effect, I actually want to read a paragraph here from Klopper-Allman's Outline of Esoteric Science that demonstrates this. It's a bit esoteric, but it demonstrates how the way you comport yourself, and it's not ethics, it has nothing to do with like Christian ideas of judgment and ethics and so forth. It just has to do with the way causes and effects work in relationship to the physical plane and the supersensible world. He says, for instance, that a weak feeling of I-ness, of the I, in one life will lead to the desire to encounter the greatest possible opposition to the I in the next incarnation, so that this I can strengthen itself in meeting that opposition. In that subsequent incarnation, the I may seek out, subconsciously of course, let's say a cholera epidemic. Cholera produces violent vomiting and dehydration, so that the blood, the particular organ of the eye, Steiner has this theory that the blood carries the eye, becomes very thick and offers the maximum resistance to penetration by the eye. An overbearing eye in one life, on the other hand, may seek the opposite condition, such as is offered by malaria, a disease that breaks down red blood cells, producing a very low ratio of cells to serum, or a thin blood. One who has little interest in the physical surrounding world will be weakly, a weak person in the next incarnation, while one bursting with health, in, let's say, this incarnation, certainly had a keen interest in the visible world in a former incarnation. Lack of interest in the stars in one life leads to a limp and flabby body in the next life. Lack of interest in music will lead to asthmatic trouble in the next life, and so on. So Steiner has these very complex ideas that it matters how you comport yourself in one life, and it will affect diseases, illnesses, interest, physiology and physiognomy in the subsequent life. So that's why he's looking at each of these civilizations for how their relationship to the spiritual plane will affect what happens when they get to the supersensible world. And with the Egyptian civilization, we have this idea of trying to see the light of the spiritual world through the physical world, with a very intense knowledge of the physical world, and manipulating it through building pyramids and temples and very complex funerary practices. And he says that a disciple who was a reincarnation of one of Zarathustra's disciples, and he calls him Hermes. Tot would have been a better name, since Tot was equivalent by the Greeks to Hermes. They're basically the same god. They're both gods of writing, and they're both funerary gods. Hermes leads the dead souls into the underworld, while Tot writes down in the judge of the dead in the underworld the results of the weighing. So the task of the Egypto-Chaldean civilization, and he lumps in Chaldean, which is a mistake. These are two different civilizations. The Chaldean and the Neo-Babylonians are just simply a very late, decadent, dying, dead phase of the Mesopotamian civilization that began with Sumer in 3500 BC. But of course, the archaeology on that was just barely coming in. Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations of the tombs at Ur were taking place in the 1920s, pretty much after Steiner was dead. And so this initiate of the mysteries of Mercury, of the planet Mercury, and these initiates are all tied into focusing on the mysteries coming from the planets, then taught the Egyptians this knowledge. And the Egyptian civilization then goes through its course and its cycle, where he says that he makes the mistake of saying that Osiris was another example of a sun being. Osiris was absolutely not a sun god. He was initially thought by anthropologists and mythologists to be a sun god. He absolutely is not. Re is the sun god. Osiris is the moon god in the underworld, which is why he's broken into 14 pieces, which is half of a moon cycle. So that's Egypt, and then we get to the next Post-Atlantean, the fourth Post-Atlantean civilization, the Greco-Latin civilization, where their task was simply to perceive the spirit world through the physical world in as concrete a way as possible. That's why everything in the Greco-Latin civilization is very concrete. Their beautiful statues sort of glow with a numinous aura, and they have a concreteness about them. And you can see the supersensible coming through them, but only in a very dim way. They're losing contact by the time you get to the Greco-Latin civilization, they're losing contact with the supersensible world, except through, according to Steiner, their mystery cults. Their initiatory cults, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Isis and Osiris cults, and all the mystery cults that were popular during the Hellenistic age were the only ones that were preserving a knowledge of the supersensible world, minus the Luciferic influence. Lucifer is the god who tempts you toward believing that the material world is illusory, but Lucifer can tamper with all sorts of things in your etheric body. Even though, as we saw, Lucifer's influence, once the moon withdrew from the earth, brought into being things like free will, and eventually, of course, karma, defiance of the gods, a sense of individuality, and so forth. By the time we get to the Romans, of course, we have a completely crass, vulgar, materialistic civilization that has fallen completely under the influence of Ahriman, which has now blocked knowledge of the spiritual world. Such individuals will be, Steiner says, isolated on the other side and will be reincarnated again as materialists until the light of the spiritual world comes through. And so there's this disjunct, a divorce between the supersensible world and the physical world that now calls forth the Christ event, which is the axis at the bottom of the V shape we've been talking about here. He's the bottom, the vertex of the V. His incarnation comes in order to attempt to bring a human being who is not occluded by Ahriman and whose astral body is ready to receive the influences of the sun's spiritual powers. He's a sun god who comes down and incarnates in human form. And Steiner doesn't go much into his Christ mythology, which is his own sort of Gnostic version of Christianity. That's to be found in one of my favorite books of his, The Fifth Gospel, which at some point I'd like to do a chapter by chapter on, where he goes through a very complex, elaborate theory about who the Christ being was. And it actually turns out to be two separate beings that have fused together. It's very complex. And so Christ then comes down and incarnates, and elsewhere he says, not in this book, that it also changes the vibratory structure of the earth. The earth has been vibrating at a very low vibrational frequency at this point, and Christ's blood for Steiner is not just blood, it carries the I. Ego is a bad word. Translators have to use it, but it's the I, just the sense of selfhood that the blood carries. Once his blood touched the earth, it penetrated it, and in a way transubstantiated it. It's like a wafer that's been transubstantiated by the magic of the Latin into calling forth the presence of Christ, that changes the substance of the wafer so that it's now the body of Christ, even though the outward physical attributes still look the same. They're not, the internal essence of it isn't. Now it's perfused with the body of Christ. Same thing with the earth. The earth becomes transubstantiated by the blood of Christ when it hits the earth, and then it changes the earth's vibratory frequency, and it enables, it gives human beings a new opportunity to perceive the spiritual world, and not just the crass materialism of the Romans. And so that's the Christ event. And then Greco-Latin civilization he has going from 747, the time of Homer, down to 1413 AD. So all the way down to the Renaissance, which is, of course, the rebirth of classical civilization. So it goes all the way down to that point, which, as I've said, is interesting because Gene Getzer demarks that as the second half of the mental consciousness structure, which is the perspectival half of the consciousness structure, or what Heidegger calls elsewhere the age of the world picture, where we get depth perspective in painting, and we get a new sense of selfhood and individuality. And the task of, as far as the astral bodies go, the subtle bodies go, the task of Western civilization, which now dawns the fifth Post-Atlantean epoch. So we've gone down to the vertex with the Christ event. Now we're going up one notch to a civilization that is in resonance with the Egypto-Chaldean civilization, is to develop the consciousness soul, which is the third component of what he calls the soul. Recall that, remember, he says the soul has these three components of the sentient soul, which tells you what's out there, has to do with the senses and perception of the senses, and the intellectual soul analyzes it, and then the consciousness soul has to do with will and freedom of the will, and also the beginnings of an awareness of a spiritual world. But he says, in the West, knowledge of the physical world, and the task of all these civilizations has been to eventually learn how to master the physical world. So the West has done it the most intensely and the best. So Ahriman's influence has been very strong in our civilization, but so also has Lucifer's. And so there's a schism in the consciousness soul where, with the Christ event, the opening, let's say, to the transcendent realm of the supersensible goes right through the door of Christ. Steiner made this famous sculpture. You can look it up. You can do a Google search on it. Where he was also an artist as well as everything else, architect. The dude was just insanely talented. Whereas his portrait of Christ is between Lucifer on the one hand and Ahriman on the other, portraying the schism in the consciousness soul between Lucifer and Ahriman, between the spiritual world and knowledge of the supersensible world and the physical world, which the West now thinks is the only thing that matters. So Ahriman has completely taken over Western civilization. So this schism in our civilization is what has to be healed, to the point where Lucifer and Ahriman have to be brought together, as they are personified by the Christ being, brought together so that the two can be perfused. And the physical world is not just seen as the only thing that matters, but we don't make the mistake that the Hindus made, let's say, in saying the physical world doesn't matter at all. The Hindus were lucky because they didn't have any Ahrimanic influences whatsoever. It was purely Luciferic in their case. The physical world was Maya. It was an illusion. And the only thing that mattered was the other world. For us, it's the opposite. The only thing that seems to matter now is the physical world and mastery over the physical plane. So the task of the sixth Post-Atlantean civilization, then, the one that will perfect the life spirit, which comes with one of its faculties is imagination, which is the ability to perceive into the spiritual plane in image form. Imagination, so to perceive into it in image form. And it's the faculty best personified by the angels, who are at the lowest end of the spiritual hierarchies. It will be the next civilization, Russia. And then after that, the seventh civilization, he doesn't say that it's the United States, because there isn't going to be any United States thousands and thousands of years from now. The planet will not even be recognizable after all the ice melts. But that's his arc of seven civilizations, the three downgoing ones to the vertex, the axial event of the Christ event, and then the three going up, each of which are in resonance with each other. It's interesting because Arthur Young, in the Reflexive Universe, also uses this V-shaped model and has a similar idea. I don't think he was familiar with Rudolf Steiner, although he might have been. But we'll look at Arthur Young in another series of lectures. So that pretty much sums up this very long middle chapter that we've been talking about here for the past several videos: cosmic evolution and the human being. And so what we'll do is that the next chapter, chapter 5, is the knowledge of higher worlds initiation. And his process of initiation is morphologically equivalent to Jung's process of individuation. They're essentially equivalent. And in Steiner's case, it's the ability to develop the faculties, the higher faculties of imagination, which, remember, has to do with perceiving spiritual images, and then inspiration, which has to do with hearing the spiritual voices, and finally intuition, which has to do with perceiving the inner essence of spiritual beings, and has nothing to do with the eye or the ear. And he'll talk about how those faculties can actually be developed. And he'll give you examples of specific techniques, as he does in his book, How to Know Higher Worlds, of which this next chapter is a miniaturization about how to develop these higher faculties. And then in the final, in the next, or sixth chapter, not final, the the penultimate chapter, he will give his prognostications for cosmic and human evolution now and in the future. So that'll be interesting. Okay, so we'll end it there with that video.